This debate, this lecture series, looks at the role of the EU. This is something that the speakers touched upon as well. Roxana was indicating that, that there's an element of regulatory dynamism if we look at a European level and the issues that are ongoing on internet governance in a broad definition. Privacy being one strong aspect in the play, but at the same time, Maciej was highlighting that we have a very dynamic process ongoing at a global level as well. If we think of the technical transition of IANA, the WSIS plus 10, these are moments where we can really reflect on what internet governance is. Again, kind of rehash perhaps that debate about what the definition is, what the role of stakeholders are. But in any case, we see a lot moving. Maciej highlighted that the EU tries to play the role of being an honest broker in all of this. So I'd like to open the floor to you, but perhaps we can have in our reflections also, what is the added value of the EU? Do we see that we have an efficient process? Does the EU perform better than perhaps its member states in this area? And we can reflect also, of course, on the current debates. Perhaps we could highlight net neutrality or anything that you're interested in. So I'll open the floor for questions, and then, of course, I'll add in my questions along the way as well. So please, go ahead.
I'm moving a bit. Hi. No, I'm sitting in front of you. I'm Jamal Shaheen, and I had a few questions, but maybe I'll start with one or two of them. Thank you for your presentations. I'd like to ask Maciej, first of all, whether you agree with Roxana's characterization of the European Commission's role. I like this idea of being hands-off and reactive. And I don't know how far your relationship with internet governance goes back, but whether you can actually talk about that a little bit. And then maybe a question for, well, all three of you. You talked about the EU's role in new fora. You talked about how the EU is working with, or how the EU has been involved with Net Mundial and WSIS and so on. I'm wondering, what about the traditional fora? So I'm tending to think a bit about the ITU and the WSIT, the World Communications Conference, and the Telecommunications Conference, and things like that. So maybe those are my first two questions, and then I have others if you want them.
Go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentations. And I have a question regarding regulating online companies, and perhaps it relates to Roxana, to your presentation. So you said that data control is a new form of power, and also you said that there are important discussions relating to innovation and privacy. And now in this context, some commentators see some potential clashes between the two projects that are on the agenda of the EU. So the creation of the digital single market, which highlights innovation very much, and then the introduction of the General Data Protection Regulation, which in fact places some restrictions on companies how they manage data, which may be a great source of information of innovation. And what I'm talking about, for instance, is a purpose limitation principle, or the fact that companies need to get users' consent every time they want to use data for new purposes. So is there, in your opinion, certain clash between these two agendas, or between these two projects, or not? Thanks very much.
I'll perhaps add in one thing, which was that it strikes me as interesting that privacy is one area where the EU is really on the forefront of, as you described, developing global standards. If we think of the umbrella agreement being struck down, or the right to be forgotten being really going forward in quite rapid pace. Why do you think that is? Is it just because of Snowden, or is there something about this policy area, something about the EU that makes it logical that this would be something that we're quite strong on, let's say? We'll let you guys respond, and then maybe we'll have another round. I don't know who wants to go first.
I can go first. Thank you for those very interesting questions. On the first question, if I understood correctly, you mean, Jamal, this distinction between a reactive and proactive policy that Roxana mentioned. And of course, as a policymaker, it's always difficult to develop a policy in times when, internet is developing so fast. It's been 20 couple of years that we have internet as a genuine phenomenon in our economic lives, and at the same time, that the legislative process in the European Union can take some time. So there is always this tension between how to address different issues, how to regulate certain activities related to internet. So. Yeah, possibly it's. I think it's fair to say that at the beginning there was a little bit of reluctance towards not the fact that we against or pro-regulating the internet, but there was more an attitude towards seeing and watching what is actually happening. Also, you have to take into account that even 10 years ago, the role of internet was completely different. Now, if you see the role of internet in economic life, it's something completely different. Like, there were a couple of months ago, there was even a problem that the airlines, Polish national airlines system was hacked, and because of that, planes stopped flying for a couple of hours. So you see that the importance and the role of internet changed dramatically. So I think that's why it's fair to say that at the beginning we had this role of actually seeing and waiting to see what is actually happening in the market. And now when we see, I think it's now clear that the role of internet is huge. We more or less know how it functions. It will still develop very fast, but we more or less know how it functions. I think now we have a little bit of chance actually to lay down certain rules in areas where it is needed for the functioning of the internet. And this also relates to the second question that was asked, and also what Tricia said about the certain perceived tension between innovation and privacy. I would, of course, allow to disagree on the very fact that there is a very strong tension between those two notions, because what you see, especially nowadays, we've already mentioned surveillance revelations and all of that actually a strong data protection regulations, apart from being a human right and all of that, it's simply something that can be an economic model for European Union. That's why it's in our interest to develop good privacy rules, because then people will be actually interested in storing their data, in having their data protected according to good rules. So this is something when there is a huge opportunity for the European Union.
Thank you for the questions and also for Macei's answer. I'll just take it from there. On linking innovation and privacy, I also don't see the two as necessarily incompatible or necessarily infringing on each other. It is true that the EU invests a lot in both agendas. From my point of view, there is a lot of funding dedicated to innovative approaches. If you look at the Horizon 2020 funding, you have a lot there about developing new tools. Now, if you think about it as completely incompatible to privacy, then I think we have a problem with the way we perceive data. In my understanding, we should also have certain limitations to how you can use personal data. There is a need for anonymizing certain information. There is a need for doing business in a conscious way, in a way that does not explore and exploit data that we did not consent to give to companies. So in that sense, I think it will be really interesting to follow how these two agendas develop in the EU and whether we can achieve the two, whether we can actually get the best of both worlds. There's also a big difference between the way we used to do business and the way business came to Europe from the US, with particular embedded understandings of privacy. There is a difference in the way we conceive privacy in Europe and in the US. And of course, when you have the internet giants being all based in the US and bringing in an approach that obviously has a number of principles implemented in their day-to-day policy, it's very difficult to turn that completely around and say, well, in Europe, we think about privacy very differently, and now we have to change everything. We have to find a way to the middle ground, if you want, right? A way to balance the two approaches. But that also tells us the EU investing much more in developing its own industry on internet. So that's something that is relatively recent. For a long time, that was not necessarily a priority, and now we see more investment in business that is local or European level. I think in Europe it's very important to look at privacy historically, and of course we have the history of intense spying happening by European governments not that long ago, up to the 90s. And of course, it doesn't mean that currently we don't have secret services using the information they have access to follow certain people, to prevent all sort of mishaps, if you want. But that in itself is what we want to avoid at the end of the day. We want to make sure that we have some safeguards and some limitations on how privacy can, on how data can be used in this context of doing business. So I don't see it necessarily as completely incompatible, but the way this agenda develops, yes, yet to be seen, I would say. There's also interesting to note that the privacy discussion peaked in Europe also as a push from civil society, and that really happened extensively in Germany and in the UK. A lot of civil society groups filed cases against violations of privacy. A lot of groups came together to discuss their own approach, sometimes just consolidating a particular approach. And it's interesting to see this bottom-up move. We want more privacy for ourselves and also for all the others. And to what extent we can make this a global standard is a different question. But I think we should acknowledge here that a lot of groups, activist groups, push this forward.
Would either of you like to comment on Jamal's question about the ITU and the role of the EU? I could perhaps add in an element of how does the EU grapple perhaps with at times differing opinions between member states, and how that's brought together. You talked a little bit about the External Action Service, but this is in part talking about external representation and how we internally come to agreements as well. You could just perhaps tackle it from a very practical perspective if you would like.
Probably the first reply to your question would be, I have absolutely no clue how we make it, but we make it at the end. It's really complicated. on the one hand, you have those different fora. So you've got ITU, which is kind of it's a United Nations agency. So of course it's very formal. Then you've got, for instance, ICANN environment, which is completely different, where you've got people saying that you don't need governments and governments are the worst evil on the world. And you also have this technical and political layer. So also it is a challenge even in discussion in-house within the discussion with the member states, that you have both diplomats and technical experts dealing with those issues. And you have people located in Brussels, in national capitals, in Geneva, where ITU is located, and then you have people in the United Nations, in New York, where WSIS plus 10 is negotiated. So it's a hell of an effort, asking if you're asking on a practical way, but somehow, because we try to talk as much as possible to each other, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of time. We somehow manage to coordinate our efforts in different fora. We manage at the end of the day to discuss different issues before, for instance, we go to ICANN. So before we meet in the Governmental Advisory Committee in ICANN, before that we have a group dedicated to a coordination which meets in Brussels, which will meet in a week time, if I remember correctly. For instance, in ITU it's a bit more challenging, because then we have a group which is called the CEPT, which coordinates European countries of the ITU, which is not only the EU, so it also adds a complexity in those discussions. But that's why also we try to discuss as much as possible before the meetings with our member states what should be our position. And at the end of the day, it's challenging, it's a lot of effort, but somehow it works. We manage to get our effort heard.
We'll perhaps open the floor for a new round of questions.
I think even without micro is okay. I listened an interview of director of Hermitage Museum from St. Petersburg. It was one discussion about West and East, etc. And he say what in now information flow is free, but in the future it will be restricted. I understood what it's like, kind of Korea or China, something like this, where it's a Western so-called democracy also. I didn't write him an email, and I didn't have a chance to ask what do he mean, and what do you think about it en gros, in English, en gros.
In general.
In general, it means the Europe also move little by little to this limitation, and the indirect the fact in this favor. Yesterday I saw the debate in French television in regards to this Paris situation. They ask some members of society, I don't know, they ask stricter measures, and finally the speaker who first defend the openness, which I also share, even if the victims, etc. I think we should stay for openness, for rule of law, sorry. Mm-hmm. So question to you, do you expect the same, less or more the same thing in Europe? Thank you.
May I have a second question, if I can? So still going back to the privacy innovation, I totally agree with you. Is that I really hope that companies will start perceiving better data protection, better privacy standards as a competitive advantage over other companies. Is that I hear these voices still, that there is a certain clash. And my second question, I don't know how relevant it is, but I would like to ask about the right to be forgotten. So the court was not really clear and specific when it developed this criteria. So not adequate, not relevant, and no longer relevant, which means that Google is left with a certain freedom on how it tackles freedom of speech, basically. And my question is whether Google should be in this position to decide on such important issues. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eugene Lim, and I am in MA in Political Strategy and Communication with University of Kent. And I'd like to hear more about Roxana's elaboration on net neutrality with management of traffic. Thank you.
All right. Do you want to start, or should I?
If you want to start, you can start.
Yeah, maybe just question by question. Of course, what you understand by technical, by control of the internet, it's actually even what is meant by controlling of the internet is very difficult to define, and there are different measures for that. But if we go to the very technical functioning of the internet and the things I've just discussed, so day-to-day functioning of the internet, ICANN and all those things, this is actually it's not a secret that the EU and Russia, we have very different views on those things. So although we admit that there is a room for improvements related to internet governance, basically we don't want to have any big change in the model. Internet functions, it's absolutely great. Let's don't reinvent the wheel when everything is more or less functioning very good, despite certain minor problems. What Russia is interested in international fora is, they say very openly, that the International Telecommunication Union and United Nations should play a much more important role in the day-to-day functioning of the internet, which for us is absolutely a red line. And you can imagine that for Russia, they are interested in a stronger role of the ITU and UN system, precisely because of role of Russia in those in those fora. So it does not come as a big surprise. As a rule of law, right to be forgotten, these are also big questions that are being discussed in internet governance. Discussions in internet governance and policy discussions. It's precisely the role of governments and private stakeholders in control in how we should regulate content. And this is you could see actually quite a lot of parallelism between, on the one hand, right to be forgotten, and there is also another thing which is also of interest, and now in the European Commission we are reflecting on that. It's a so-called notice and action. So basically, when you have illegal content, should it be taken down immediately? Should Google decide about it, or should content maybe stay? Should there be any special procedure for that? In general, both discussions run in parallel, and now we are having also a public consultation on the role of internet intermediaries in all those procedures. So I would like to have a definite answer to you. What is the golden rule for that? But I think that with development of internet, we'll have to be still learning by doing. What we are trying to do is, of course, as a European Commission, as European institutions, is also to try many new tools. So not only say that it's self-regulation or it's pure regulation, but also what we are trying to do is to support self-regulation on even what is called to support co-regulation. So basically telling private stakeholders, first of all, to think about the rules, and then we can take those rules up and to think how we can accommodate them as public authorities. Like, for instance, you can see with the right to be forgotten, what was one of the first things that EU did were the guidelines adopted by the Article 29 Working Party. Let's see how they're going to work, hopefully, but trust me, we are very well aware of this tension and those. But it's a very good question.
Thank you again for your question. So on the restriction of information flows, I think this is very important when it comes to digital archives and how much we turn our museums, virtual museums, for example, and how much we turn our collection of papers and articles entirely virtual. And here, if we think about how the information might be restricted, of course, you have direct ways of control. You just block the information, you filter certain parts of the information, or some indirect forms, which might mean that in order to get to this information, you just have to go through 5 different gatekeepers, and at some point you will just give up throughout the process because you don't have the time or the energy to do all of this. And the question is, will the information we have and we increasingly digitize be restricted for business reason? Would it be restricted for security reason? Will it be restricted for political reasons? Now, this is all somehow in the background. We don't have this on the table as a current discussion, whether we can keep the current model in place for that long, that we can guarantee neither us nor our grandchildren will ever have to pay for getting access to certain bits of information. We currently do. Sometimes you have paywalls for a newspaper article. If you want to read it, you have to pay for it. So to what extent this becomes the prevailing business model is a different question. So far, we have used data as the business model. So you would give in some personal information in order to enjoy some services for free, as in not paying for them. But in fact, paying indirectly with your data, because the business model in place has been based on the collection and use via profiling of your personal information. It's really something that we need to be paying a lot of attention in the future to keep what we have now free of charge and also free of different types of blockages along the way. Now, when it comes to the right to be forgotten, we can link the two in a way. So what happened in this case is that a certain newspaper in Spain decided to digitize some of its archives. And when they did that, a Spanish lawyer got quite outraged by the fact that what appeared on the Google search for his name, the first thing that appeared was a notice of an auction. I think it was his house that was auctioned in order to pay for a debt that he had 10 years ago. So at some point, bringing back this information that he actually dealt with immediately after. So the case was solved for more than 9 years when this information started appearing as the first thing on his Google profile. On the Google search page when you put in his name. And of course, as a lawyer, that has huge implications for the people who might actually contact you. So he filed this case with the local data protection authority, and in the end, the case made it all the way to the European level, to the Court of Justice, where they actually decided that Google had to de-index the information. Some people say that naming this the right to be forgotten is a bit of a misnomer because it does not reflect a complete oblivion of the information. It's a de-indexing of the information. So you can still reach the information if you can go directly to the source, or if you have another way of getting to the main article, for example, if you don't go through Google or if you have more keywords in. It does not mean that the information is not available anymore. So in this case, the journal, the newspaper did not have to delete or get rid of the information they had on the auction. That stayed, just the way you would reach the information via Google changed. But when the court decided that he had a fair case to be brought in front of the Data Protection Authority and of Google, they also said it's up to the private intermediaries to solve this mess that in a way they created. So, so this is where your question comes in. So Google is left to decide how to deal with this request. The court decision was very ambiguous on the implementation part. They just said if the information is inadequate, excessive, or exactly no longer relevant. Exactly how you establish this is going to be very difficult to be done in practice. But they said, well, if you have one of these situations, you are entitled to require the search engine to de-index your information, and then Google will have to judge in each and every single case how they could do that, because no automated procedure is allowed by the court. So what happens in practice is that a lot of Google officials come in front of the press and say that, in fact, for them this is completely unprecedented and unexpected, and they don't know how to deal with the situation. And they convoke something that they call the Advisory Council. So a group of experts that does a tour in 7 different capitals to get advice on how they could implement it. And at the end of the day, Google doesn't really follow all the recommendations of the Advisory Council, because by the time the meetings end, they already start implementing it. And interesting enough, the day after the court ruled, in this case, they received something like more than 50,000 requests for de-indexing. So now I tackled this issue in an article that is about to come out. And here we named Google some sort of a court-style body, because in fact the court requires Google to be the first instance in a judicial process. This is exactly the power that they are transferring to a private intermediary at the end of the day. And Google is not transparent at all about the way in which they do this. I've asked in several instances, and my colleagues have also asked this question to representatives of the company, and they weren't able to tell us how many people they employed to actually deal with this. They weren't able to tell us how they actually decide on whether this information is relevant or no longer relevant, or it's something that the public should know about or not know about. Because, of course, you get into very difficult situations if you have a public figure working in politics deciding that certain pages should be delinked based on something that newspapers reported on corruption about the person, right? Then how exactly do you draw the line there? And the court says that, well, you have to first go to Google, so they handle your request. They can decide to de-index or not de-index. If you're not happy with the decision by Google, that is, they did not de-index the pages, you can take it to court. But that means that the burden is put on you as the final user, at the end user, to pursue this further. And of course, there are associated costs with it. It's easy to file a case online, right, to Google, but it's not necessarily easy to take it to court afterwards. And there are no specific guidelines on how exactly this can be done and through how many layers you have to go to get the final decision. So there is a lot of interest in getting actually the clear picture of what's happening, how exactly Google is managing it. So far, not in a very transparent way. And what exactly it means in the long run, because you also transfer a degree of expertise that public regulators won't have anymore, because they don't even see the cases that get on the table, you know. So whether you want this to be the future is quite challenging. If you don't have the expertise, if you need to look at a case in which Google said no and the court said yes, or a case that is absolutely challenging, are you going to invite the Google experts to come into the room and tell you how to regulate around this issue? It creates a lot of dilemmas about the future. So a very good question. On net neutrality, now the debate has been ongoing for at least 5 years. It has been a really long debate. there are a couple of perspectives on this. One is the perspective of the companies. They say, well, we need to manage certain traffic because it's simply not possible from a technical way that everything is transported in an equal manner. So we need to do some management to avoid that the network is congested or that we have other problems. And now how you do it is a different question. You can use something that is very intrusive, deep packet inspection, look at every single bit of information that circulates through your network and say, here, video download, no. On copyright issues, no, we don't want that because you're infringing on other rights. Most likely you are, so we're going to stop it at the source, not even let you finish the movie download. Now, if you think about an ISP, an internet service provider, they have tons of information circulating every minute. So probably they wouldn't do it in a manual way. They wouldn't look at your transfer of information, my transfer of data packets, but they will do it in an automated way. They will say, well, everything that resembles this should be blocked or put in quarantine till we decide what it is, And that is problematic also on the privacy level. What exactly can the internet service providers have access to, and how much should they go into this? Then you have the perspective of regulators that say, well, in fact, we have seen that the network has developed in an open way. We want to preserve that. We want the information to be treated equally so that you don't decide on an individual level who gets to see the movie and who doesn't get to see the movie. But we understand there might be certain limitations in how you do it, and we understand also that you might give priority to certain services. And this is what the European Parliament said on the 28th of October. They said, we want all the traffic to be treated equally, except for in situations where there is real-time communication that is a vital interest. Like if you have a video conference surgery happening at the time these devices are connected, you might want to give priority to that over somebody downloading something. This is what they said. Now, exactly how this is going to be done is yet to be seen. But that also opens the door for a lot of other exceptions. That has not really been tackled that much, because once you say, okay, we have a rule and we have an exception, of course, in 2 years, the exception will be different because technology advances very quickly. And you don't necessarily know at this point to what you open the door. So and whether we want this two-speed internet, as people call it, no? The internet that runs in a particular way, and then the internet that you can pay for much more in order to have everything treated equally. And that's a situation we want to avoid, because once you introduce this, it becomes very discriminatory, and also it just it basically rolls back all the development we have done on this so far. So, yeah. This answers your question.
I think the two of you highlighted a very interesting debate and difference of opinion slightly on what we do with alternative modes of governance, how we involve companies such as Google in helping regulate whether it's data protection issues or dealing with more net neutrality standards and the role of internet service providers. It definitely is a question to be asked of how these processes are legitimate, whether they're efficient. We need faster solutions, and at the same time we very much value the input of that we get through a democratic process of involving many stakeholders, of having legislators and the court involved. This opens up a whole new debate, but I think we need to sort of also close this session in any case. So I want to ask if there are any burning remaining questions in the room. I'm sure the two speakers would be happy to answer your questions after the session as well. That just leaves me to thank you as an audience for joining us this evening and for a very illuminating, stimulating debate on internet governance and the role of the EU. So thank you very much to Roxana and Maciej.
Thank you.